Okay, now I am coming to the next part of the poem. So, give but his horns the slightest touch. His self-collecting power is such. He shrinks into his house with much displeasure. So, give it horns. Means there are two tiny horns on its head. And once it will touch the horns, what will happen? His self-collecting power, means the poet has pointed out that the snail has a very inherited power. What type of power? That it can shrink it back into its own shell. So his self-collecting power means it can gather itself, and it can gather by its body and coil inside the shell. So it is such, means it is a very great power of the snail, and he shrinks into his house with much displeasure. So the snail does not like the intervention of the outside world or human beings. So it becomes very unhappy whenever its horns are touched or it is disturbed. So whenever it is disturbed, it just retires into its shell by applying the self-collecting power and by shrinking its body and coiling inside the shell. It is not ready to accept any kind of touch or any kind of intervention from the outside world. It is quite happy with its own life, and it shows much displeasure because it is quite unhappy. Why? Because its horns are touched, because human beings have touched its horns, and it is not satisfied with their interference. So it what is the act of protest it does? The act of protest is that it just shrinks back into its shell. It takes shelter securely inside its shell. So whenever it takes shelter inside the shell, it does not have any connection with the outside world. So it remains very peaceful and happy there, and leads a very secured life inside the shell. And whenever it just goes back inside the shell, it does not have any connection with the outside world. It is quite happy to cut off or to sever his ties with the outside world. So, what happens? The next paragraph starts with like this. Who seeks him must be... The next paragraph starts like this. Wherever he dwells alone, except himself. Him has chattels none, well satisfied to be his own whole treasure. So, wherever he dwells, means wherever he lives, means he lives inside the shell, and he lives inside the shell alone, and there is no such personal belongings of the snail, and it just feels happy and quite satisfied to be himself inside the shell, and it is quite satisfied with his own life, and it feels that he is his own whole treasure. So he is his own whole treasure means it seems that the snail does not like to be with anyone else, and does not like to be with anyone, and does not like any friend. He wants to live a very happy life being alone. He's completely alone. He takes shelter inside the shell, and there is no such thing who can come and interfere in his life. And whenever he hides himself inside the shell, that means he is quite satisfied with his life, and he does not want to keep any contact with the outside world. So wherever he dwells, means wherever is particularly it's his shell, where he lives inside the shell alone, and there is no such thing which can disconnect him from its shell. So it lives inside the shell. in a very happy manner, and it is quite satisfied to lead a happy life there. So the snail shows displeasure when human beings touches its horns, or any kind of interference come from the outside world, and it is quite satisfied to be in his own whole world. So chattels means personal belongings. Okay, personal belongings, and dwells means lives. So the snail is quite satisfied to be his own whole treasure. This line particularly points out that the snail considers himself to be the precious one, and he is not concerned about anyone else or anyone being outside. He or she considers himself or herself to be the most precious one, and he has no connection with the outside world. He is very much satisfied. He is very much satisfied with his own life. He lives alone, but he is sort of he is in a sort of very cheerful mood. He does not feel the loneliness, and he does not want anyone to come in between him and his life. So he leads a very nice and satisfied life, being his own whole treasure. So he considers himself and to be the treasure, and he is proud of himself. So the last is the two paragraphs, like, so whenever its horns are touched, the snail becomes very much irritated, and it is full of displeasure, and its self-collecting power is such, means it has the power to shrink or to recoil back into its shell, and it similarly does that because it does not like any interference of the human world, and whenever its horns are touched, it just returns back to its own shell. Similarly, it dwells in such a place where he lives alone, and living alone is very much satisfying for him, and he considers himself to be his own treasure. So this is the third and fourth stanza of the poem The Snail.